Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another episode of Ships of War, the series where I look at historic vessels, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes the downright notorious. And what I try to do is situate them in their historical context and also try to judge how they've been represented in a particular game system and see if I can gauge how fairly they've been treated in relation to their historical performance. And for today's episode, we have some mystery guests, which are here courtesy of the classic TSR board game, The Hunt for Red October. Now, as you can see, they are both on their hidden side because, of course, in this game of double blind and fog of war, most of the time when you're looking at your enemy's fleets, that is all you're going to say. But for the purposes of this exercise, and because I'm such a terrible dice roller, I am just going to have to ask them both to voluntarily reveal themselves. So we have here, representing NATO and in particular the United States, a Knox class frigate. And in the opposite corner, standing in for the as the representative of the Soviet Navy, is a Krivak class frigate. Now, I am departing from my usual modus operandi with these because what usually in this series I compare individual ships, named ships particularly. But today I've decided I'm going to do classes, and part of the reason for that is while both these vessels in the game and in reality represent very large real classes, there was so much variety within these broad classes that if you focus on one ship, you do slightly run the risk of leaving some interesting things unsaid. Not that I'm going to go into too much detail, otherwise we'll be here forever. But before I dive in, just a reminder for those of you who have never played The Hunt for Red October, what on earth have you been doing with your lives? Or who have not seen my previous videos on the subject, a quick reminder of what the stats mean. So the really important things to focus on are the numbers at the bottom. So the one on the left is the ship's detection capability, and that's for everything: air, surface, subsurface. The higher the number, the better. The number on the right is its offensive capability. And these are sometimes color coded. If it's black, they're sort of, it's what's printed on the card. If they are white, as these two are, then they get a bonus when they're fighting against surface vessels. They roll extra dice. And of course, if it's yellow, neither of these have that, then they're particularly effective against aircraft. The only other thing to note is that the Knox has a little helicopter icon, denoting that it's got anti-submarine, very strong anti-submarine capability and enhanced ability to detect submarines. So it can actually inhabit the ASW screen on the task force cards. Otherwise, you've got your fairly standard vessel silhouettes, which are nice and very accurate for these two. The class name and its US Navy/NATO designation, FF, of course, meaning frigate. So why have I picked these two? Well, normally I like to fixate on the capital ships, so this represents a little bit of a change for me. But also, I find the Cold War a very interesting period because it's one where you've got very important, very large assets on both sides, but they do rely on a vast number of supporting vessels in order to keep their primary assets safe. So these are the foot soldiers, basically. And what I find very interesting about these two is that they were essentially conceived to do very similar jobs, but they interpreted those roles in very different ways. For NATO and the US Navy particularly, the primary purpose of ships like the Knox class was to provide dedicated anti-submarine defense for a task force or a convoy, or if they were just on their own, they were able to hunt submarines. And the Soviets were looking at theirs to do the same thing, but over time they introduced a very interesting strategic wrinkle to it. So the Krivaks, when they first appear, are billed as being basically large anti-submarine warfare ships. Later on, they're referred to in language that puts them in more a sort of defensive. I don't want to say Coast Guard role because that's a bit misleading, but one of the Soviet strategic concepts was that their SSBN, their nuclear missile carrying nuclear submarines, would have these designated gathering and launch areas. And the job of the Krivaks and similar vessels was to create a safe zone where their submarines could operate and launch their missiles. So it's a very interesting take on the whole defensive anti-submarine warfare role, where you're not protecting surface assets. You're actually, ironically, a surface ship protecting submarines from other submarines. Very, very interesting and very clever. But let's do a little bit of history because there's a lot that we can say about these two ships that make for very interesting comparisons. So I'd said that they were huge classes, and they were. The Knox class frigates, I believe, were the largest class of post-war frigate the US Navy ever built. They totaled 46 ships in the end. And the very first ones entered service in 1969, and the very last ones entered service in 1974. Now, the Soviets were not very far behind with the Krivaks. They built a total of 40 of them over the period of the Cold War. The very first one of theirs entered service in 1970, and the very last one within the scope of this game, Hunt for Red October, entered service in 1976. Now, as I say, they actually built 40 vessels, but 8 of them were a slightly weaker version, the Krivak 3. And these were used by the Soviet Maritime Coast Guard services. So they were basically glorified Coast Guard vessels with extra guns and fewer missiles and fewer ASW weapons. So I think for game purposes, we tend to discount them because their roles and their weapons outfit didn't really suit them that well for frontline warfare. But, 32 ships is still very impressive. And of course, you can tell from those dates, they all enter service at roughly the same time. And they go through a lot of evolution. This is the other thing. One of the things that makes them so incredibly bewildering is that there are different refits applied at different times, roles change, weapons outfits change. Now, all of this granular detail is completely hidden on these little counters here. So I'm just going to do a bit of a dive in by starting off with what these ships look like. And let's start with the Knox class. So I've got to thank Wikipedia for having such lovely photographs of these ships to hand. So this is the USS Robert E. Peary up top, and that is the Fanning below. And I like these images because they give you a wonderful sense of just, what the ship looked like. You've got the perfect broadside view. You've got the lovely top-down view. So here is what I'll call your garden variety Knox class frigate. And the thing that makes their profile so distinctive for me is what's called the MAC. Now, the MAC in naval architecture terms is a composite of a mast and a stack, as in smokestack. So what you've got here is a structure that serves as the ship's funnel, but it's also being used as a support for all of the ship's electronic eyes, so its various search and weapon guidance radars, and of course traditional signaling being what it is. You've got your signal halyards and all the rest of it. So it's a really great way of economizing on space. And the Knox class, really, a lot of what drove their development was all about economy, because they were introduced at the time where the expense of building such ships was really beginning to catch up with the US Navy. And Defense Secretary McNamara was looking for savings at the time. And now the problem with this is you can be as imaginative as you like, and the Knox class were a very imaginative design, but whenever you try to economize, it doesn't always lead to good things. And just to make matters worse, there was some initial confusion about quite what these frigates were going to be armed with. I mean, their original designation was actually escort destroyer. That was downgraded to frigate at around the same time the first units entered service. But in the end, despite teething troubles with getting a sensible design together, the US Navy ended with what were really quite serviceable vessels. So, to give you a sense of what their armament comprised, you've got the 5-inch 42 caliber gun there, which was a very capable weapon, but it drew some criticism because the ships only carried one. And as far as gun-based weaponry goes, in their initial design iteration, it was the only gun-based defense against incoming missiles if your other systems failed, and it was a bit clumsy for that purpose. And also, if you were unlucky enough to be engaging a ship at gunnery range, having only the one gun was not thought of as being very ideal. The previous class of destroyers had mounted twin 5-inch guns, even though they were of a slightly smaller caliber. And immediately after that, you've got the ASROC launcher, which is the main. As completed, this was the main anti-submarine warfare missile launcher. The ships were supposed to have fixed torpedo tubes, but hardly any of them ever got that armament. And then at the stern here, you've got the air defense missile launcher, the surface-to-air system. And these ships mounted Sea Sparrow in the end, which was not a bad weapon. They were originally slated to have the very interesting drone helicopters, the DASH, DASH prototypes, which the US Navy was playing with at the time. This was meant to be unmanned anti-submarine helicopters, very impressive for the day. In the end, they ended up with a fairly standard manned helicopters. It was something that the US Navy decided to give them Sea Sprites in the end because the Dash unmanned helicopters didn't work out so well in testing. In terms of their propulsion, you had a fairly conservative arrangement. The machinery spaces were not excessively large, but one thing that did draw a lot of criticism was that the ships only had a single shaft. So one propeller, which is not a lot of redundancy if something goes wrong. And you can get a sense of just how slim these vessels were, even though they were quite large by frigate standards. By this wonderful top-down view of the fanning, again, you can see the dispersal of the weaponry. You've got your anti-submarine missile array. You've got your turret, your 5-inch gun house there. Now, interestingly, that doesn't look like that, does it? And it shouldn't, because that's the replacement air defense system. So CWIS 20mm cannon systems replaced the missiles on many ships later in their careers. Now, overall impressions of these ships by their users was that they were nice, they were comfortable, they were very roomy, good ships to serve in. Officer country was slightly larger than it had been in the preceding class. But if I show you this really nice photograph of the USS Bowen, there's going to be a bit of a spot the difference moment here. I'm just going to turn it back just to give you guys a bit of a clue. Have a look at the bow of the Peary over there, and then have a look at the bow of the Bowen here. Now, in service, particularly in the Atlantic, these ships were found to be very wet. And although they did have steel hulls, admittedly weaker superstructures, but steel hulls, they suffered extensively from water degradation and water damage because they shipped so much green stuff over their forecastles. So from about 1980 onwards, they began to refit them by adding these significant bits of flare and extra strakes just to build the bow up a bit. That improved things, but did not solve the problem completely. I would say these ships were fairly successful. They had good careers lasting all the way into, all through the period of the Cold War. But they did fall victim to post-Cold War budget cuts. And by 1994, so after a very short service life in some cases, all of them had either been sold out of US Navy service to other navies, or they had been sold for scrap. So they or were just put into permanent reserve. They did not last very long, and McNamara's Follies, as they were semi-affectionately or derisively known, had a very short end. Sorry, very short life followed by a quick end. Now, what about the Soviet Krivaks, their rivals that I've lined up here? I've already touched on their intended function. I mean, they're very elegant ships, as you can see from the picture. They seem quite alien to certainly to me, because I'm so used to Western naval architecture that post World War II Soviet era naval architecture, I always find it quite striking. I don't know about the rest of you, but that certainly is me. So up here we have the Pitlivi, and believe it or not, this picture was taken in 2009. Again, thank you, Wikipedia, for these lovely photographs. So, unlike their US counterparts, the first thing I can say about these is that they have had incredibly long use lives. Now, that does not mean they're better warships, particularly, but like the Knox class, the Krivak class had an awful lot of longevity built into them. And there are good reasons for that. They are well constructed ships in terms of their hulls, and they do have the capacity for easy refit. I mean, the fact that there are four varieties of Krivak, or at least there were, shows how adaptable the design is. And it's not just their striking appearance that made an impression in the early days, it's the sheer variety of weaponry. So, bearing in mind that these were designed and announced as anti-submarine warfare ships at the time of their inception and when the first ones entered service in 1970. The very striking quadruple missile launcher on the forecastle, that immediately attracted NATO attention, and it was feared that these were anti-surface, surface-to-surface missiles. So, oh my God, the Soviets have brought in these anti-submarine warfare ships that nonetheless have the capabilities of a missile cruiser. This is terrible. And they had a variety of other tricks up their tricks up their sleeve, I should say, as well. There were these very striking mounts aft. In the first generation of Krivaks, these mounted twin 76 millimeter guns, I believe. Let me just check that, because I might. Nope, 76 millimeter. The rusty penny has just fallen out of my brain. Later versions had these two mounts replaced with single 100 millimeter guns, and that's one very easy way of spotting a later Krivak from an earlier Krivak. If you get a good view, just have a look at those after turrets. And like their Western counterparts, they also had anti-aircraft batteries. So they had a small surface-to-air missile launcher just before the bridge. Weirdly, in completely the opposite place to where the US Navy had stuck theirs, but there we go. And they also had the very striking Soviet RBU 6000 anti-submarine warfare rocket launchers. So both these ships were capable of mounting anti-submarine rockets, which of course airdrop torpedoes for anti-submarine work. So very similar in their focus there, but their appearance suggested very strongly in the early days that they were multi-mission vehicles, and that foxed NATO for a while. It was only when they were able to get a bit of information about Soviet maneuvers and test firings of the weapons on these ships that they realized that actually these impressive looking things only fired short-range anti-submarine missiles. What was more worrying if you're a surface ship was the regular torpedo tubes. They had two quadruple torpedo tube launchers that mounted 533 millimeter torpedoes. So now those could be used for either anti-submarine or anti-surface work, but the likelihood of you getting that close unless something weird happened was unlikely. That said, for surface engagements, these were arguably a bit better armed initially. Now, what changed things was the refits of the 1980s, where both classes of ships had significant upgrades. The main one was the fitting of anti-ship missiles. Now, for the Knox class, this took the form of altering the ASROC very slightly so that it could now fire harpoon missiles. And this was a game changer. They went from their 70s configuration where they couldn't hurt surface ships all the way up to being able to deal them significant damage. The Soviet ships were supposed to have all been refitted in the same way, but only two, possibly three, received equivalent upgrades. And that may have been due to cost because the Soviet Union was in dire financial straits by the end of the 1980s. Chernobyl and all the rest of that had basically put paid to a lot of their naval expansion and refit plans. So enough of the history. How accurately, yes, Oscar, thank you. I value your opinion, buddy. Yep, the cat has just come in to offer his own thoughts. He may agree with me, he may not. I don't know yet. So how accurately does all this translate into game terms? Well, let's start with the detection rating. So the Knox has been given a rating of 4 and the Krivak a rating of 3. Now, I think this is a bit of a difficult one to quantify. Both classes were pretty well endowed with the best that their respective nations could give them in terms of search radars and sonar systems. Now, at the time they were introduced, NATO enjoyed a very slight technological edge in both departments, but this gap widened considerably over time. So I'm tempted to say that the Krivak does deserve its slightly weaker rating relative to the Knox. Now, because this game buries a lot of granular detail under general ratings, that's probably as fair as it's going to get. This game certainly doesn't deal in fractions, much to my relief. The Knox does have a helicopter icon to indicate that capacity for anti-submarine work. The Krivak does not. Now, the only difficulty I have with this is that is accurate insofar as the only Krivaks that were able to carry helicopters, ironically enough, were the hobbled Coast Guard variety rather than the frontline vessels. But given that they were designed to be anti-submarine warfare ships, in game terms, this does weaken their ability in terms of trying to detect submarines. And their sonar suites, to be fair, were not that bad. So it's a funny one, technically correct in that they don't have a helicopter icon, but it does weaken their anti-submarine role a bit in game terms. And lastly, we have the only other rating we're given, which is the 4, with an emphasis on anti-surface ship capability. I'm going to say I agree with that because Hunt for Red October models a hypothetical conflict that takes place in the Atlantic in 1989. If the game had been set earlier, I would have had serious reservations about that because neither of these classes were intended to be, their main purpose was to hunt submarines rather than surface ships. However, because both sides received their surface-to-surface missile upgrades in the early to mid-1980s, that rating makes sense. It certainly does for the US. With the benefit of hindsight, it makes less sense for the Soviets. As we know, as I just said, only a couple of their ships ever received this upgrade, and those 2 or 3 would have probably gotten lost against the big mass of Krivaks in service. However, the thing I have to remind myself of is that this game was designed in the mid-1980s. And while there was a bit more information available about the Soviet Navy at the time, the newest stuff was still very much under wraps. And in complete fairness to the game's designers, there was no way they could have known that financial difficulties were stopping the Soviet Navy from re-equipping its Krivaks. The Soviets probably did go to the trouble of announcing that they intended to rearm all the Krivaks. And it's not unreasonable to assume, as a game designer working in, I don't know, 1986, 1987, that by the time the hypothetical war starts, the Krivaks would have been upgraded with a strong anti-surface capability, in addition to all their other abilities. So I'll give them that one. I think it's fair. Plus, at the end of the day, it does balance the game, because the Hunt for Red October does also reflect the disparity in numbers in certain classes of warships. So NATO has a bit of an edge, a slight one, in some of the frigate classes, if not in many other vessels. So I think that this is a fair representation. The only other ones I'm going to touch on are speed, because this is not represented on the counters, but both these ships can move 3 sea areas every turn, so they have equivalent speeds. I think this is fair in terms of the level, the grand strategic representation in this game. The best speed the Knox class could make was 27 knots in most weathers, probably a bit less if it got really stormy. The Soviet ships could manage 30 knots in just about anything, and if they really, really pushed themselves and went crazy, they could crank all the way up to 32. Both of them had a very respectable cruising endurance of about 4,500 nautical miles at 20 knots. But again, the Soviets had a very slight edge in that one. So very slight, not enough to make the Soviet ship any faster in the game. And lastly, there's survivability. They both take 2 hits to sink in the game. I suppose this is fair enough. In terms of survivability, compartmentalization, and damage control systems, the Knox class had a noticeable lead over their Soviet counterparts. We know this now. Whether it was clear in the 1980s is not so certain. But I will say that given the rugged construction of the Soviet ships and the fact that the NATO lead was not that significant, you would notice, I think, in terms of, number of redundant systems, pumping capacity, number of compartments the ship's divided into. The Knox is unquestionably better. But again, given the lack of granular detail in this game, giving them both the same survivability is fair. So there we go. That is the end of my Cook's tour of these very fascinating warship classes. Thank you guys very much for bearing with me as I dive into the murky waters of the Cold War. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have putting it together. And I hope that you feel I've matched the combatants up fairly and given them both a fair hearing. But as always, thank you so much for the pleasure of your company. That's what really makes these videos worth it. And for the joy of the comments and the interaction and the wonderful community we have here. To my long-suffering veterans, as always, a huge hello to you guys. And to anyone who may be visiting my channel for the first time, a massive welcome to you. If it's Hunt for Red October or Wargaming that's brought you here, please have a meander and try the other videos out. I hope you find more stuff you like. But whoever you are and wherever you're watching from, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you all again in the next video. Take care. Bye.